Hey everybody, this is Brian Kelly with Association Mavens, where you get direct access to some of the foremost thinkers and teachers in the association industry. My guest today is Thad Lurie. Thad recently became the Chief Operating Officer of EDUCAUSE, an association that advances higher education by promoting the intelligent use of information technology. He's worked as a technologist in the association industry for over 12 years and is also the Vice Chair of ASAE's Technology Council. Welcome to Association Mavens, Thad.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I've been eager to talk with you for at least a couple of months now. I know we've been trying to connect and just have a discussion about the content that was going to be in the session that both you and Reggie Henry from ASAE presented at the ASAE Technology Conference this past December 2013. So I was hoping that we could talk beforehand to get kind of the sneak peek insider look at what you guys are going to be discussing, because I thought it was a fascinating topic. But now let's kind of look back in retrospect at some of the things that came out of that session and the discussions that you had. Sound cool?
Absolutely.
All right. So for the audience, the name of the session, or the title of the session, was CSuite Update, the Crossroads of Technology and Business Innovation. Could you really quickly give us kind of a high-level breakdown of what it was exactly that you guys covered in this discussion?
Sure. When Reggie and I started talking about doing the session at one technology council meeting back in the spring, what we really wanted to do, knowing that at that point that there was going to be a CEO track at the technology conference, which was a new addition and a very successful one, I might add, we thought, how can we really give them something that kind of explains where IT is and some of the new things that IT is doing within organizations, and speak their language in doing so. We think a lot of the issues that exist, the communication issues between executive and technology, are oftentimes based around the fact that technologists are not communicating in business language. They're talking in tech speak rather than business, and the CEOs either aren't necessarily understanding it or aren't wanting to hear it. So we wanted to put a session on the docket where we could really speak their language, talk about the issues they wanted to talk about, and also hopefully kind of change the viewpoint of the conversation, as it were. Many times the conversation either becomes there's a conflict, or people are just not speaking the same language. What we wanted to do was really get CEOs to think differently about technology.
Well, it's pretty interesting because while I didn't get to your guys' session, I did attend at least 2 or 3 of the other sessions in the CEO track. And the thing that I thought was really interesting was this very idea that the CEO really needs to become the technology leader and really be a driving force in helping at least guide the entire team to make these very relevant, important technology decisions. And it's no longer become a situation where it's like, well, we'll let the technologists completely deal with it. And the reason why is there's this I think, intention, this focus, this realization that we need to align the technology with the business operation even more so than we've done in the past, that it's a critical thing. And so I really am eager to dive into specifically what you guys talked about in your session because of that.
And that's absolutely true. The keynote of the CIO summit, the CIO CEO summit, which was the day before the Tech Council, was given by the CEO of AIIM, and he just, actually that wasn't it. He gave one of the keynotes at the Tech Conference.
Oh yeah, that was the opening morning. John Mancini, who you're talking about, he gave the opening to that track.
The day before was Gary Shapiro, and he's the executive director of the Consumer Electronics Association. I got them crossed up a little bit because they both talked about similar messages, which is that the CEO does need to be involved in technology. They don't necessarily need to be a technologist, but they need to have an understanding of the strategic impact that technology has and that technology has on their business. how the underpinnings and the underlying systems and platforms and components affect their business is part of it. But also, if you look at the other side, where the innovations are coming, new products, new services, new business lines, things like that, they're either technology based at this point or they have a significant technology component. And I think a number of organizations are struggling with not only the systems and processes in place, but also the governance and the decision-making process around, how do we evaluate what's best for our organization and how we move forward? What do our members really need and how do we best service them? The expectations of the members are changing wildly with respect to generational gaps, mobility, social. I mean, these pieces are all, they fall in many cases directly into the lap of technology, or at least in part. And to have an executive director or CEO, a chief staff officer, who isn't necessarily understanding what the impacts could even be, I think that's where both Gary and John are saying CEOs need to be plugged into this to know where things are going, because to plan effectively and to really make informed decisions about your business, you need to understand the technology.
Well, this is a really good topic, and I think let's circle back to this and dive in a little bit deeper. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about association culture and kind of get your thoughts on this idea. So what I'd really like to know is, from your perspective, why is an association's culture so important to fostering technology-based business solutions within their organization? Can you share anything related to what the impact is, or why it's relevant to really be dialed into the culture to drive the technology decisions that are being made?
It's funny that you say you weren't in our session, because that's one of the things we really talked about. It's not just the association culture towards technology. I think it's the association space in general in many ways. Generally speaking, associations compared to the private sector and business are 2 to 3 years behind with respect to technology and sometimes some other things. And it's partially because they're just generally more risk averse than businesses. The risk reward ratio for member-driven associations, and even trade associations to a lesser extent, is not the same as it would be for a private sector business. So they move a little more slowly and a little more deliberately. And I think because of that, paired with some things we talked about in the session that I'll dig into in a moment, it's been challenging for associations to, I would go further than say adopt technology, but really embrace technology. It's not about fighting technology anymore. It's about understanding that. I often ask association executives when they start talking about technology, or we're not ready for that, or we're thinking about doing that in 18 to 24 months, and I say, do you think your organization is going to be using less technology in the next 3 years? And everybody has a stare at, that's very funny. But I'm not asking because it's funny. I'm asking because if you compare that directly next to kind of the culture that you're talking about, there's this incredible chasm between them. And I think there is a general understanding that, oh, yes, of course, we're going to need to do mobile. We have to do more with social. We do need to provide new benefits. Our members expect to be communicated with in a certain way, all technology-based, and yet the acceptance of a slower technology growth curve in associations is relatively standard. Yeah. So that's something that, on the Tech Council, we talk about this quite a bit. How do we move the needle on the cultural issue? Not just within a singular organization, but within associations in general. How do we promote a greater understanding of what technology can do? How do we get CEOs and executive directors to recognize and embrace technology as a main driver of their business and of innovation for their organizations? And, we've gone about it in any number of different ways, but I don't think there's a silver bullet here. I think it's an extremely important issue that we need to continue to talk about. I think the conversations that we have, even if we're doing it one at a time, one CEO at the technology conference, one CEO at the annual meeting, if we're able to, again, as I said, what Reggie and I are trying to do is get CEOs to think differently. Everyone in the C-suite, everyone in the organization, get them to view technology as a business partner, get them to see technology as an innovation partner and a leader in these areas. I think that's going to make a huge positive difference.
Absolutely agree. Well, one kind of path I'd like to deviate down with you a little bit and see what you think is building upon not just the association culture within the C-suite as well as the different business units within the organization. Do you have any thoughts or insights into the board and pulling the board into this idea as well that technology has got to be something that we put more focus on, put more dollars into? Any thoughts on that you have?
That's a very good question. Interestingly enough, the organization I now work for, our board is made up, for the most part, of CIOs from universities and colleges. So slightly different crowd that we're talking to. Yeah. Most organizations are not like that. Their board is made up of foot doctors or lawyers or people who work in the plastics industry. It could be any group, and their exposure to technology is going to be in their industry, generally speaking, as opposed to within associations. So I think it's important for the CEO, again, to have an understanding of what's going on, because they're going to be the one doing the majority of the communicating with the board. At the same time, the technology leader within the organization, this is another one of these times when they need to speak business.
Yeah.
Because if they go and start talking about how they're going to do a web service API integration with these two things, and they're going to see, you're laughing already because the board, their eyes just glazed over, and they might be understanding, but chances are pretty good that even if they are understanding, they're not interested in that level of detail. They don't want the tactical. They want the strategic. They want the high umbrella view of what's going on and how this is going to change the member experience, how it's going to impact the bottom line of the organization. It's definitely a challenge. I think also in many cases, the mouthpiece of technology within the organization is the CFO. And I've written on this before. Some CFOs, I'm sure, are very capable of accurately and passionately representing technology at the board level. That being said, finance is generally focused on operations and cost cutting. So if you put IT in the finance department, a lot of times it's generally going to be a very operations focused and kind of how do we reduce costs, how do we keep the lights on and keep the trains running on time kind of thing.
So, okay, this brings up another thought, and I'd love to see what you think about this question, is we're talking about the CEO essentially becoming better in tune with the technology and some of the decisions that need to be made around technology and essentially driving that. But let's turn it around, because what you were saying about the technologists going in and having these discussions and using jargon, language, etc., that most business executives just they're not dialed into that. Is there any ideas, any insights that you would have for technologists to clearly, concisely communicate what it is that they're doing at the executive level, as well as maybe even interacting with the board?
That's a great question, and I think if you look around right now, you're not going to see a lot in the way of training or professional development opportunities specifically for technologists who are looking to move towards a more executive role.
Yeah.
And that's something at the Tech Council that we are discussing right now is, we want to groom the next generation of technology leaders, but we want them to be business leaders, right? We don't want them to focus entirely on the zeros and ones and on hardware and networking. We want them to really understand their organization's business and how technology supports that along with the mission. So it's an excellent question. I don't have a specific answer as to how do we get these folks, and not everyone is suited to this. How do we find them, identify them, give them the resources and mentoring they need, and the training and the opportunity to become really effective leaders within their organizations. I think on an organization by organization basis, it's something that executive needs to focus on. If you don't have a business technology leader already who you think is a strong leader and understands technology and is really providing value, identify one.
Yeah. Someone
that you think is going to be really good and start to provide them with both training and opportunity to see what they can do. Because I promise you will get to a point where you will wonder how you ever move forward without this person. I mean, you can get someone that they do so many different things and they provide so much value from a staff perspective. It's incredible.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, well, let's transition a little bit. The next question that I had for you was really around the idea of how can an association reinvigorate the technology as well as the business service relationship. Like, let's say that there's this chasm right now between what technology is doing and what the business managers within the organization are focused on. How can an association get in better alignment between those two things? Was there anything that you guys discussed at this session that kind of touched upon that?
We talked about communication a lot because we think that's really the foundation for a number of things. It's not only that, communication from department to department, individual to individual, but I think generally speaking, technology staff in the past have not been the best communicators. We haven't been the most forthright. We haven't used the right terminology and language many times. So I think there needs to be an improvement on the technology side. At the same time, other departments need to make an effort to understand the technology. For a marketing department to say, well, we don't need to understand HTML because that's technology's job. You're smiling, and I tend to agree with you in that if we're going to grow in communication and business acumen, other departments need to grow in their technology expertise. There was a really interesting discussion going on based on a session that David DiLorenzo from National League of Cities did. I think it was like a 20-minute quick hitter on the exhibit floor at the conference, and it was all around what basic technology skills do staff need at this point? What is kind of the acceptable lowest common denominator? Because it used to be, if you could use Word, you were pretty good. If you could use Excel, you were amazing. And if you knew what PowerPoint was or Access, you were essentially a technologist. Yeah. And that is no longer the case. I mean, I think it's partially generational and partially just from an expectations perspective. If people can't use Excel pretty strongly, I think now we start to look at them like, really? You should be able to do that at this point. Mm-hmm. Or if you can't put together a slide deck with some backgrounds, if you can't, so now it's carried over onto the technology listserv for those that are interested. You can go to Collaborate and see there's a very vibrant discussion around what exactly should people be expecting, whether it's for entry-level staff or otherwise, what's that basic technology skill set look like? And going back to the earlier point, how does that improve communication, between departments? I think the second thing is intent. And that's an organizational culture thing. You have to assume that the other folks you're working with are trying to do what's best for the organization. And as soon as you do that, it colors the communications a little bit differently and more positively, and I think that tends to spin things forward. The last piece is definitely transparency from the IT side. Technology departments for 5 or 10, 15 years spent a lot of effort black boxing things, meaning they didn't want other business units in the organization to understand exactly what was going on. They would say things like, well, we'll take it from here. You don't need to understand this. We've got it. That's a technology thing. You don't need to know that. And I think in many ways, as I said in the session, I almost these words exactly, that's coming back to bite us now. Yeah. We've created this culture of kind of men in black, don't look behind the wall or the curtain. And now we need them to. For us to build trust and for us to build these communication bridges to the other business units successfully, they have to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And if all we're doing is, throwing up the veil of secrecy to make people think how complex everything is, that defeats our purpose. So really the transparency piece, not only from, allowing the sunlight in, but also being more than willing and able to explain in layman's and business terms what is going on and why, I think that's a critical element.
Yeah, I think the point that you make about it's not just the technologist's job to speak in layman's term, but it's also, the business managers in the organization to also understand or, make an effort to understand some of the slightly deeper technological things. We're not saying you have to be a full-blown technologist, but at least making an attempt to understand, what the possibilities are, what the basic language is, etc., I think is a big piece of the puzzle. And then also the fact that historically it probably made sense to have, this wide chasm, because there weren't a lot of people who had the savviness to be able to understand the technology side. And it's like, here's the dividing line. Technology belongs here, and then you're going to make the business decisions over here. But I think with this, the younger generation, millennials that are moving into, as each year passes, more and more prominence within organizations and in the roles that they play in their departments, that they just naturally are bringing this technological savviness to what it is that they're doing. For example, I know, I've got a younger brother who's in his early 20s, and he is, he studied a certain topic that's not related to technology, but for fun, he's learned how to code. And I've seen this a lot where, they may have a discipline that they've focused on that's maybe communications related, but they know how to set up an HTML website. They know how to go in and style the the CSS. And then they also understand how they can work with the iOS development kit to build an application for, it's like, seriously, it's just interesting realm that we're moving into, where more and more there are individuals who not only understand business, but also understand technology. And I think for associations, I think that's an important thing to realize. And maybe there's even some things that we can learn from millennials about how to continue to move forward and get better interaction between those two groups, the business and the technology.
I mean, that's an entire topic, especially for associations looking at the generations. And I like to focus on their expectations and how those are different, especially with respect to mobility and social. But I think it's also important, one of the things Reggie and I touched on in the session was how you're looking at technology, not just for change management, but for organizational management and for, really helping to run your organization effectively. And one of the things we talked about was, when you bring somebody in to run social. And I've seen so many organizations that say, oh, well, we just need to get a 25-year-old in here, and they're going to run our social media campaign. And I keep thinking, well, what was I wrote an article about it, something like, just because my neighbor is close to me doesn't mean he's good for fixing my car. It's not about proximity, it's about skill set. And just because their age, they have a basic understanding of social and they've used it, that doesn't mean they know how to effectively run social media for your organization, right? I've seen it happen with marketing too. Well, let's get some young marketing people in here, and they're going to understand what other young people think. And okay, they're young people. I am a shopper at Target. That doesn't necessarily mean I understand all shoppers at Target. I think there's kind of a misunderstanding there, and associations are just putting people in roles that they may or may not be ready to fulfill or prepared for. That being said, if you flip the coin, the expectation side from both the staff and the members who are younger on the most mobile social axis, I mean, if it doesn't come to their phone, they're not looking at it.
Yep.
They can't interact with you on social media. You don't exist. So having to explain that to the board and, going to them and saying, look, our demographic is these people are going to be our members. Are we connecting with them when they're in school? Are we connecting with them when they're young? How are we doing it? Do we have a social media presence? How are we managing it? What are our goals and our business goals for that? How are we measuring our success? What do we define as success? Really putting all that stuff in place, it takes time and thought and effort. And I think a lot of organizations are still kind of passing it over. Yeah. They understand it's not a fad. I mean, it's certainly not going away, but I don't think they quite know what to make of it. So what's interesting is, you go to the technology conference, and so many of the buzzwords are the same. It's social, mobile, big data, and I think I was talking to John Mancini, and I was saying, it feels like we've had this conversation for the past 3 or 4 years. It's the same conversation. I think we're making progress, and there are some new things that are starting to bleed in. But what are we really doing? What kind of progress are we making, and how do we quantify that? And it was very interesting. The last phrase I'm going to toss out, because I thought it was one of my highlights from the entire conference, was something John said during his presentation. and that was a phrase I guess he coined, and it's the Amazoning of expectations, which I absolutely love, because so many times, staff are like, well, why do I want it to work like Amazon? Amazon can do this. Why can't we do it like Amazon? And first you say because they have a $5 billion R&D budget, but at the same time, our board is using Amazon, our executives using Amazon, and that is the gold standard at this point. And despite the fact that our website budget might be $500,000 rather than $500 million, there's still this kind of set of expectations where they have this experience, and that's what they expect. There's Google, there's Amazon, there's eBay, there's all these other sites that are putting that in front of people, and that's kind of what we're being held up to now. Yeah. And so understanding how to manage that, and understanding how to communicate back to the board and the C-suite about that issue, it's another thing we touched on.
Very cool. Well, Thad, we're coming to the end of our discussion, and before I let you go, would love to just see, was there any other takeaways from the session that you guys put on, any conversations that arose with the audience during that you think would be relevant for folks here to know or to understand?
Good question. We spoke a little bit also about the role of the future CIO and the future state of the organization. We talked a little bit about Dave Coriel's maturity model and kind of the IT culture within organizations and the leadership around it. I think the slide deck's available on SlideShare if you're an ASAE member. It may have even been recorded, the session, if I remember correctly. So people would be, obviously you can reach out to myself or Reggie, and we're happy to continue the conversation. But yeah, it's the second time we've done it. We did the session at Annual also with a slightly different twist. Obviously, it wasn't quite as technology focused, but yeah, I think it's a worthwhile conversation, and we always enjoy having it.
Very cool. Well, Thad, thanks so much for doing this interview, and thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to sign up today in the upper right-hand corner of this website to be updated via email when new interviews are posted. Also, follow @BrianKellyNow on Twitter to stay on top of all things Association Mavens related. Lastly, please submit your recommendation for which Association Maven you'd like to see interviewed next. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more great interviews. Bye-bye.